Hello and welcome to the Rockonteurs podcast. I am Gary Kemp.
And I am Guy Pratt. This week on the show, we are talking to an artist, a writer, a producer, and a powerhouse of British pop.
A man who has written some of the best songs of the last 40 years. Welcome to Rockonteurs, Nick Lowe. We first met, I'm sure we may have met before, but sitting at Robert Elms, the broadcaster, Robert Elms' 60th birthday last year when all was sensible and we could do things like that.
No social distancing at that one.
I was thrilled to sit next to you because you've been so much part of my musical history and, dare I say, growing up as well, because I'm a little bit younger. But certainly, you know, through that whole punk era and then into your sort of silver-headed, more sort of personal performer. Dotage, yes. Have you met Nick, Guy?
I have met Nick a long time ago. Very, very long time.
Weren't you with touring with Pink Floyd?
Yes. It was a hotel room in New York. And Pete Thomas was involved, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And a Corby trouser press.
Always.
I have actually seen a Corby trouser press in a hotel room in America, but only once.
Oh, of course, they're rarer than in England, of course, yeah.
Yes, I think they are.
Yeah. Well, Pete Thomas used to have a whole thing about Corby trouser presses, didn't he? He used to have was probably best left.
For anyone who doesn't know and doesn't travel as much as rock stars do, it's the place that sits on the corner where you just sort of throw your jacket when you walk into the room. And I've never pressed my trousers on tour. Well, I was lucky enough to have someone travelling who did that for us, but I'm sure you've used one before, Nick.
I have. I've actually got a very ancient one at home, but I've never, like you, I've never felt the need to put a smart crease in my trousers when I've been on the road.
It's your shirt. You want something to do your shirt. Never mind your trousers.
Yes.
So, I mean, where to begin with you? Because you started out in that pub rock scene and in the Brinsley Schwartz band, and then you were a solo artist. You produced Elvis Costello's records, The Pretenders, Dr. Feelgood, Graham Parker, and then you've gone on and had hugely successful solo records. There's so many sort of heads to look at when you're looking at Nick Lowe, isn't there? Who are you? Who do you think you are?
Well, I've done all those things. Well, that sounds terribly glamorous. When you say hugely successful solo records, I think that's slightly egging the cake a bit. But I suppose I think of myself really as a songwriter, because I think I always was anxious to have some sort of a career in the music business by which I could have the great good fortune and to be able to make a living out of making music. But I wouldn't have to do the hard work of being famous, really, which is quite convenient because I've, never enjoyed the sort of success such as you gentlemen have. But I got this sort of horrors about what real success in the we call it show business or the pop business really. At a very early age, I got a very sharp shock because I was in the band. You mentioned Brinsley Schwartz, and I won't tell the whole story; it's too long. But we weren't victims at all because we did it with great enthusiasm. But we got involved with a big, massive hype. Probably the first one of the modern era in about 1969, 1970. Where
people always talked about Brinsley Schwartz as the definition of hype.
Yeah, I think they did. Yeah, we fell in with a management team who got us a gig at the Fillmore East, basically, which was quite clever of them to do that because we really weren't much good. The Fillmore East was the sort of mecca of cool music in New York City, and they got us a gig there, and they chartered a jet from Aer Lingus and filled it up with literally every journalist they could. There was people there not only from the music press and the daily papers, but from sort of trout fishermen, popular mechanics, and they crammed this plane full. And it was very much a sort of straight world and a kind of hip world. There was the underground press, all smoking pot at the back, back of the plane. That was in the days when you could smoke anyway on an aeroplane. Of course, it seems strange now. Anyway, everything that could go wrong did go wrong.
Well, how was the gig? What was the audience like?
Oh, it was terrible. It was really terrible. We well, we made so many mistakes. We were supposed to go. Oh, I can't start in on this. It's such a long story, and
That's what you're here for, Nick. You're here for that.
well, I could go on about it a bit. It's looked so good on paper. We were supposed to arrive in New York about a week before and go and check out the Fillmore, see a couple of shows there and do a bit of rehearsing. On this gear we'd ordered up, they asked us what gear we wanted, to do this show. So, of course, what we did, instead of just copying the sort of crappy old stuff that we were used to playing through, we sort of gave them our dream list, of these massive Fender Showman amps, we all fancied. We were kids, And so, of course, when we got to New York, which, by the way, was about half an hour before we were due on stage because we couldn't get into America, we were confronted with all these brand new, strange amps. We didn't know how to get a sound out of them or anything. It was mistakes like that.
Wow.
That there's so much to this story that's why I'm umming and ahhing about
How
it.
did you get to that stage, though? I mean, who were you growing up? When did you first discover music, and what kind of music did you love? Because just to slightly bring people up to speed, Brinsley Schwarz came out of what we call the pub rock scene, which was a sort of pub rock, which is the predecessor of punk rock, and had a real country feel. The sort of sound you were trying to get was kind of like the band, influenced by that.
We loved the band, yeah.
But what about you growing up, Nick? What got you into music, and how did you end up in Brinsley Schwarz?
Well, my mum was very musical. She actually came from a sort of showbiz family, kind of vaudeville. Her folks were in vaudeville, and she was a pretty good singer. She's always sounded to me a bit like Rosemary Clooney. Whenever I hear Rosemary Clooney, you don't hear very much anymore, but I'm always reminded of my dear late Ma when I hear her. But anyway, she was really pretty good. She taught me a few guitar chords, and she had some good records as well. Most of the things that most sort of kind of middle class families had back then. A lot of show tunes, Oklahoma, South Pacific, good singers, Sinatra, Nat King Cole, Peggy Lee, Dinah Washington, Doris Day as well. But amongst them, she had a couple of records by Tennessee Ernie Ford, who's best known here for 16 Tons.
Oh.
And he had a sound, I didn't know it then, but he had a sound which I could tell even I was about 7. She had these 2 10-inch albums by Tennessee Ernie, and I played them incessantly. I liked all the stuff. I played all these records and liked them all. But Tennessee Ernie's stuff, I didn't know it, but it wasn't sort of Nashville country. I didn't know it then. It wasn't Nashville country. It was actually California, West Coast country, which had much more of a jazz style to it. There were a lot of jazz players, I guess, went up there, during the war. That's where they made all the aircraft and the shipyards and things like that. Those folks wanted this kind of swing thing in there, which they sort of more homegrown Nashville stuff was much more kind of hayseedy. This had a slight sort of uptown glitter, great players. And I could tell that there was something about this stuff that really rang my bell. It was like a cartoon.
Is this sort of music that like Jimmy Webb was aspiring to, or even the sort of the Crosby, Stills, Nash scene?
No, before that, it was much more old time. It's more like, what's his name and his Texas Playboys.
But is it what they aspired to as well? That West Coast country? I'm trying to focus on what that sound is.
Oh, really. No, it's much earlier than that. This is sort of 50s, even kind of post-war. It's got They're playing on acoustic guitars and sort of Hawaiian steel guitars tuned to a jazz chord. You'd recognize it as soon as you heard it. This stuff. Yeah. It was a real sort of 40s and 50s thing. I heard this. It sounded to me like the musicians playing on this stuff were all in Tennessee Ernie's gang. It sounded like Tennessee Ernie was the cool guy, and then he had these cool people in his gang, putting these great licks in. The drums were so swinging, and it was fantastic music. And that really got me into it. But I put it on the back burner, of course, when I started to hear rock and roll. And then, of course, the Beatles. I was, 15 or something when the Beatles came out. I was crazy about all that. The Who, the Kinks, Stones, all of that.
Your whole, sorry, I've just skipped forward a little bit to come back, is that because your whole oeuvre became known as power pop, which was actually a term coined for the Who and those bands in 1966.
I think when it comes to that, I think of being, you mentioned about the Brinsleys being, we love the band, and that's what we were copying. Being in the Brinsleys was a bit like going to some sort of college, because we all lived in the same house. When the thing in New York all went tits up, we didn't break up for some reason. We should have broken up, really, but we didn't. We sort of got our heads down, and we all moved into this big house together. It was sort of like we didn't think it was a hippie commune, but it sort of was, really.
Getting it together in the country.
Yeah, that's right. And we didn't have any gigs, so we just started practicing and thought, well, we've got nothing else to do. We might as well just start trying to actually be good. And we loved the band, but then as we got more into them, we started being interested in what their influences were. And that opened up a whole other thing about New Orleans music and
Memphis
blues and things like that. We'd never had any real contact with. It was quite hard to hear that stuff over here. But we used to do a lot of work in Holland. We used to go over to Holland quite a lot. They love pub rock over there.
What was that pub rock scene? What was the essence of it? Because I remember at the time, I was actually in a pub rock band. I was a kid. I was 14, 15. I played in a band with a bunch of guys much older than me. I was sort of servicing what they wanted musically, because they were kind of really into the whole double denim country stuff that you're talking about now. And we were called the same band, But around that time, there were all these other tribes. There's the prog rock kids, there's the glam kids, Roxy music. But there was definitely an element of English bands that wanted to be American. Americana was so enticing, wasn't it?
Well, it was. It actually was. But it was really later on in the Brinsleys that I certainly started trying to encourage them to stop being a sort of generic, I mean, it sounds a bit much for me to say I tried to stop them, but I figured that it was much cooler to start doing stuff which had a little bit of this in it and a little bit of that, not just be, we're a country band, or we're R&B group. And we started, because the pub rock thing, to get back to your early question, was the band was supposed to be like a jukebox, but didn't play very loud. We certainly didn't play very loud. That was our thing. We played really pretty quiet, but we could rock and roll.
Were you playing bass at this point?
I was, yeah. But we'd play these pubs that, we had residencies in them. But we try and do things like, as well as our own stuff, we do covers. And because we lived in this house, we could learn up, 3 or 4 new tunes a week. And we try and do whatever was number one that week, for instance. So it didn't seem like a music lesson, some boring music lesson. We tried to make it much more fun and, so you couldn't pinpoint what we were trying to do.
But that doesn't sound like you had, say, ambitions to be the next biggest band in Britain. Or am I wrong to say that? It sounds like you were just trying to make the soundtrack for someone to order their next pint of real ale.
It was really, the pub rock scene has got a really bad rap, In fact, I use that expression myself, I have done in the past, it's a bit pub rock, meaning a kind of earnest boogieing, that's what it came to be known as, which I find, terribly tiresome, tedious. That few things worse than a bad blues band, and most blues bands are bad. A good one is a beautiful thing, but they're very, very rare. And that's really, I'm afraid, due to the feel-goods, really. When they were so great, and they blew everyone away. It seemed so simple what they were doing, and unfortunately, they moved out of the pubs. They started to get too big for the pubs. When they moved out, their places were taken by many, many copyists, and that really killed the whole scene, because it just got this boogie thing, just tired everybody out.
What was your introduction to the Feel Goods then?
I met them playing in the pubs. I think we were still playing pubs when they came along. We were pretty successful through doing it. It was only really a London thing. I only really worked in London. They tried it in a few other cities, but it didn't really catch on. But we started to sort of, from being the laughing stock that we were, when we came back from New York, in the funny way that the Brits have of, they're loving an underdog, we suddenly became the sort of darlings of this scene, and we'd done all this practicing and rehearsing. So we got pretty slick, with this, and we had a huge repertoire we could do. And so we started to make something of a comeback. We moved out of the pubs then. We got a bit too popular to stay in, and the Feel Goods came along.
There were other bands like Ducks Deluxe, wasn't there? I know one called Bearded Lady, and there was all sort of those kind of names. Curzal Flyers, of course. But during this period, Nick, you wrote one of the greatest songs ever written. I mean, let's face it, what's so funny about Peace, Love and Understanding comes out of that period, doesn't it?
A bit of synchronicity there, which of course Curtis Stigers covered on the Bodyguard album.
Yes, he did.
Well, the film that I was in, yeah. He never covered any of mine, though, did they? And I was in the film.
Well, that is just not right, Gary.
But that's when you wrote that song, isn't it? About that time.
I always think of it as the first original thought I had, because up till then I'd been copying my heroes. Well, I don't know if it was the same with you guys, but when I realized that publishing was songwriting was where the body was buried, I thought, well, I better learn how to do this. And so I just started copying, rewriting my heroes' catalogue. And then when I'd finished with that, I'd move on to somebody else and rewrite their catalogue.
Whose catalogues can we find in your catalogue?
Oh, well, the band, definitely. I love them. But Van Morrison, Crosby, Stills and Nash, that sort of thing. I went through all the...
And I suppose there's a bit of Lennon in that title, isn't there? What's so funny about Peace, Love and Understanding?
Well, I suppose there is. It was the original idea was for it to be not exactly a joke, but a little bit less sort of profound than the song has come to be known for, the sort of profundity. And that's down to Elvis, I think. Elvis Costello, he used to come and see the Brinsleys. And we used to see him generally when we played up in the sort of Liverpool area. He used to come. And when I became his record producer, he said to me one day, I want to do that Brinsley song, Peace, Love and Understanding. And by that time, like all bands, that never make it, your repertoire just goes in the great celestial dustbin, of unwanted material. And unless you're lucky enough to have a couple of them plucked out, and I had 2 songs from the Brinsleys plucked out. One was Peace, Love and Understanding. The other one was a song called Cruel to Be Kind. But it was Elvis who pulled Peace, Love and Understanding out. And he really, put the hurt on it, and that caught people's attention. And
before we get to that, you mentioned Cruel to Be Kind just then, which is absolutely stunning song. Yeah. So that was a solo record of yours, but you're saying that it was somehow left behind from Brinsley's.
Yeah, it was. I was involved with Stiff Records, back at which was the sort of bridge between pub rock and punk rock, really, the early Stiff days. And I was involved with that. I became the sort of house producer for no other reason than I'd been in a studio more often than anybody else. I didn't really know what I was doing, but in those days, if you said you were a record producer, then you were one. And that was in the days when you produced records by waving your arms around and telling a few jokes, and getting people at it, But anyway, I started to get a bit of attention. I put a couple of records out on Stiff and got a bit of attention. And Elvis Costello also, whose records I was doing, he got more attention than I did. But he got an offer to make records for Columbia Records in the States. And because of association, they offered me a deal as well. And the great Greg Geller, who signed both of us to CBS, He was a lovely old school kind of record guy, A&R guy, you know, almost like a college professor. You know, he wasn't like one of those slick, hey, how you doing, baby? You know, he wasn't at all like that. He was this kind of professor. But he signed me an Elvis, and when I handed over everything I'd recorded, all my demos and everything to him, he heard this little demo the Brinsleys had done of Cruel to Be Kind. And originally it was rather like a song. It wasn't a rip-off of the song, but I wanted to write a song that had the same energy as The Love I Lost by Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. I love that
I remember
song.
that.
So Cruel to Be Kind had that. I mean, obviously it wasn't as good as the Philly rhythm section, you know, that played on Harold Melvin's record. But it was us trying to do that groove, you know. And Greg Geller said, look, I've been listening to your stuff, you know, and there's a song there called Cruel to Be Kind that I really think you should think about re-recording. I said, yeah, Greg, yeah, because I thought that was, you know, I'd done all that, you know, that was the Brinsleys, you know. Right. So I said, oh, Greg, yeah, thanks, man. But look, I've got this song about a film star who was eaten by her dog, you know, which I think is way more interesting, you know, and he would nod away and, you know, say, yeah, I hear that. Yeah, that sounds good to me too. I want to hear that. But, you know, I really think that could, and every time I'd see him, he'd lean on me, but in the most lovely, gentle way, you know. By this time I was with Rockpile, this band I was with Dave Edmonds and Terry Williams and Billy Bremner, and we were doing a lot of recording then. And one night in the studio, I said, look, I'm getting lent on to do this song, this Cruel to Be Kind. You know, do you think, how about it, boys? You know, do you think we could knock this one out? And so they were a bit sniffy about it. But anyway, we got down to it and I started having a pretty good time. And then Edmonds came up with this brilliant vocal part in the Cruel to Be Kind, and suddenly it started taking shape, and we left Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes behind, and it turned into it was a pretty reasonable hit.
It was. It was number 12 in America, wasn't it?
Yeah, it just wouldn't go into the top 10 for me.
Hey, man, take the top 20, that'll do.
I'll take the top 20, yeah.
But you and Dave seem to make things quite complicated for yourselves in terms of your recording and stuff. I mean, you always seem to have complicated recording setups, didn't you, in terms of contracts and stuff, where it had to be his record, and then you had to make a basically Rollers compilation or something.
Yeah, well, that was a little bit earlier on. Yes, after the Brinsleys split up, I wanted to get a new record. I was signed to United Artists. I wanted to get out of that record deal and actually do Stiff, you know, because I was me and Jake Riviera were sharing a flat at that point. Jake was my manager, and he was inventing Stiff and designing this new record label and the way he wanted it to go. And I was very keen to do that, but I had to get out of my contract with United Artists. So I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll just write some really terrible songs, and they'll just chuck me out, you know. And so I did this thing called Bay City Rollers, We Love You, and and sent it into them, and they loved it.
That's our Hitler.
No, they thought it was great, and it was a hit, as a matter of fact, because they released it in Japan because the Rollers were really, really big there, and it was actually quite a big hit in Japan. But I did a follow-up to that called Let's Go to the Disco by the Disco Brothers, and that one did the trick. They booted me out after that.
But Nick, thinking back to where I was in sort of 1976, 77, and the whole punk thing beginning, and, you know, I was going to all those shows. You know, when I'd look in the NME, which was my sort of music paper of choice, and I saw a picture of you, it would be like, the grown-up in the room. And you really felt like that you were the guy who was somehow not a Svengali, but you were the one that was just keeping all of these brats together. And you produced what I still think is the greatest punk record of all time. And it was the first punk record. I remember that brilliant picture on the front sleeve, New Rose by The Damned. How was it for you to end up producing one of these anarchic groups?
Well, I met them on a festival in France called the Mont de Marsan Festival. It was a punk festival. Anyway, I met them down there, and I really liked them. I thought they were like a garage rock and roll band. I love garage rock and roll, and I always thought that was different from punk music, which I didn't really care for very much. I was a bit older, and I'd been a mod, so I liked something with a bit more of a groove and a tune, and I wasn't crazy about what became known as punk music. Ramones, definitely, I thought they were great, and The Clash, one or two of them, but I didn't really go for quite a lot of it. And I thought that the Damned were like a garage rock and roll band, more like the MC5 or the Stooges or something like that, and I thought they were great. They used to pull my leg, call me granddad and uncle, and I think I was 26, I think, at the time, which did seem sort of ancient compared to them, but I thought they were great. And I don't know how that record came out as good as it did, but it's is a great record.
Under 2 minutes.
Yeah. We recorded in this place, which I don't know if did either of you ever record up a pathway in Stoke Newington?
Yes. Spandau did that. We did our first demos in there.
Did you really? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Because you would have done. Yeah, that was your sort of stomping ground up there.
It was, yeah.
Did you know that that building was Oswald Mosley's, where Oswald Mosley kept all his fascist literature? His all his leaflets and placards and these flags.
No, he's still there.
Yeah. No, he's gone.
Dire Straits recorded their first single there as well. Yeah, which whatever that was called.
And I think the Police did. The Police might have recorded Roxanne there.
Yeah, I think they did their first album there. Yeah.
And Fire, Crazy World of Arthur Brown, that was done there as well.
Wow.
Considerably earlier than when we were there.
You produced another amazing act as well, The Pretenders.
Yes, I did. I was friends with Chrissy, but I feel a bit of a fraud about this, because Chrissy and I had a brief but wonderful fling. I don't think that's too,
It's a family show, Nick. You have to cut that stuff out.
Much to say. But
cut it out, yeah.
We were good friends and still are.
Pete Frame needs to do a sort of rock family tree of people who have had affairs with each other from each band. That would be much more interesting, wouldn't it?
Well, I remember Chrissy used to come round to the flat and she'd pick up a guitar and she was singing, doing these songs that she'd written. And I'm sorry to say, I didn't think they were much good. And she was probably singing Brass in Pocket and who knows, what but I didn't, I don't know about this, Chris, really. But anyway, she'd play these songs and then a couple of years later, she contacted me and said, look, I've got a record deal, you don't fancy producing our record, and she sent me a demo tape. And I'm ashamed to say, that I didn't really listen to it. I didn't do anything about it. And she'd phone me up from time to time and say, have you listened to it? And I meant to last night, And then one day she called me and she said, look, have you listened to the tape? And I said, well, I haven't actually. She said, look, I'm at the end of your road. I'm going to come round now. I've got a copy of it and you're going to bloody well listen to it. So I did, very, very sheepishly and shamefacedly, and I still didn't really hear
what song was it? What song?
Doing. Well, it was a number of them, but right at the end was this Kinks song, Stop Your Sobbing. And I thought that was absolutely fantastic. And so I said, well, look, I'll tell you what, Chris, why don't we do Stop Your Sobbing and see how it goes?
When you were getting into your production, who were your production heroes?
Well, really, it was Dave Edmonds. He was really something in the studio, and I really had to work hard to try and become friends with him. He was very reclusive. I was pretty in awe of him, and eventually he let me come and sort of sit in the studio and watch him. He used to make these great records on his own. And He used to do everything. So I'd sit at the back, and then eventually he started letting me go out and scratch a mic to see if it was on or move something around. And then he'd let me drop him in, I'd start to drop him in to fix a guitar thing and then a backing vocal or a hand clap, And then eventually I brought him a song one day when he was doing his album, and he liked it and he recorded it. And it sort of went on like that. But he was so fantastic in the studio, the way he wasn't overawed by the equipment, by the studio. He would really sort of dominate it.
You produced one of the great records for me, Blood and Chocolate, Elvis Costello, which was in the 80s.
Oh, you like that one? Oh, good.
There's a track on there called I Want You. And I think that's the greatest song of a cuckold ever. A jilted lover talking about his ex-girlfriend wife. The energy in that, it's vicious. But I mean, I remember when I was actually breaking up from my first wife, that became the song that said it all for me.
Oh my God, really?
It became one of those songs that I kept going back to. There's so much drama in that. I mean, do you remember that tune? And did you remember specifically how is it to then, once you've broken Elvis and he becomes one of the greatest rock stars in the world or songwriters in the world, how do you go back in a room and tell him what to do?
Oh, well, we had a pretty sort of close relationship, really. And he's a really great musician, most of the best people I know like being told frankly how they're doing. They don't like to be just fawned over. And well, some people do, but most of the best people that I've ever run across, they don't really like that. They really like to be told what the score is. And without throwing their toys out of the pram, and storming out or anything like that. Sometimes you don't want to hear it, but if they know that it's a considered opinion that you're giving them, then there's no problem at all. And I always got on very well with him in that respect. Is that sort of what you meant?
I think so, yeah, absolutely.
Well, if I can throw in a little personal one closer to my heart as a bass player, because I always wondered how, being a producer and a big picture guy, how kind of seriously you took your bass playing. Because I always remember as an aspiring, school kid musician, the first time I heard I Love the Sound of Breaking Glass on the radio, I thought that's one of the most prominent and best bass sounds I'd ever heard.
Well, I only wish I'd played the bass on that record.
Oh, no! Oh, no, I assumed you did.
That's the last time you'll do this show.
It's not at all.
You did on top of the pops.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
You did it, so in my favour.
Yeah. No. That was the aim, but I think it's the one and only time I've gone into a studio with really a half-baked idea, with a couple of guys, bass player and a drummer. And said, look, boys, I've got this idea. It sort of goes a bit like, it's got a kind of Bo Diddley beat, and it goes like this. And it was, I Love the Sound of Breaking Glass. And we worked this thing up in the studio. And the bass player, Andy Bodnar, and it was the two guys from Graham Parker's group.
Ah.
And Andy Bodnar said, have you got a little lick, you could stick in there, something a bit saucy, and he came up with that. And my first reaction was, no, I don't think so. But then suddenly, after I'd heard it, well, not suddenly, after I'd heard it 2 or 3 times, I thought, this is really great. I've never heard anything like that. And the same with the piano solo, which was just Bob Andrews, his first run through, but he did that sort of crazy piano solo in it.
Yeah.
And I guess I was, I started to feel that really you can do anything, there isn't really a rule book, you can try anything, stick anything in the pot.
There's something weird about this song, right? Which I, as a kid, thought it wasn't that. I was 16, 17. So I'm thinking there's a bit of a conspiracy theory going on here because there's a connection between you and Bowie. Because here was, he had a song called Breaking Glass. You have a song called I Love the Sound of Breaking Glass. He has an album called Lowe, L-O-W. You then release an album called Bowie, B-O-W-I. So what was going on?
You're having a laugh.
Well, I was a great admirer of his, and I've always been an admirer of his rather than a fan, I suppose. And he is great. There's no doubt. I think I always was much more interested in what he was wearing, and his kind of everything else about him. I thought he was. I never met him. Did you ever know?
Yeah,
him?
yes. Guy's played with him.
Yes. Well, I've got lots of friends who knew him well, and I never met him, but I never heard anyone say a bad word about him. He seemed like a really cool guy. Well, obviously he was a cool guy, but he seemed like a nice man too. And I was a great admirer of his. So it was just I think that breaking glass thing wasn't. I think I got that by osmosis. I must have.
Right.
There was a film as well called Breaking Glass, wasn't
That's
there?
right. That was later. Yeah,
very popular title around about that time.
There was something else really in the kind of music you made at the time. So there's these boys making punk records and the Bowies and all that, and they're really earnest and serious. So it's not to say you're not serious, but what you were doing, and to a certain extent what bands like Squeeze were doing, was a sort of ironic pop that I'm kind of connecting it with that first artist you said you love, that sort of those pseudo cowboys back in California who were playing a bit of a game about a character, about being someone else. So, and you're making music that were very character driven, that had this sort of tongue in cheek slightly about pop references. Is that true to say?
Yeah, I think so. I think we were playing around with it, and certainly with Stiff Records, we really had a ball there, to putting records out in the wrong sleeves and, sort of creating mistakes, putting the wrong label on and scratching messages into because we were music fans as well. We were record collectors and fans, and we loved all that stuff, little mistakes and things and misprints on the sleeve. And here we were, we could do them on purpose, just do a limited run, of mistakes and release them and then recall them, that sort of thing. So there'll be 2 copies out there, which would suddenly be really valuable. We were just having fun with it. It was,
We haven't really got onto your later stuff as a solo artist and this incredible voice you've discovered in a way. I mean, I know you wrote a song with Johnny Cash years ago, but you've kind of developed this way of, I think, beautifully just having a very, very simple semi-acoustic guitar and your voice, and it's all you need now in your production.
Well, that's very kind of you to say that. I thought it was sort of needs must, really. I came to a stage in the early 1980s, when I really thought that I've got to change my act, really. My brief career as a sort of pop star was over. The public had moved on, and I was so I decided to really change my style. I was in a pretty bad way, not to put too fine a point on it. I was really exhausted and drinking too much, and my marriage had gone south as well, and I really needed to have a change of mind. And so I did. I sort of locked myself away for a year or two. And in that time, I sort of developed a theory about this kind of songs I wanted to write and the records I wanted to make, whereby I could take advantage of the fact I was getting older, which at that time didn't have any time for people who were older in the business. You were absolutely past it if you were 30. Nowadays, you can't move for old gits all still at it, But back then, it was a young man's game, and that was it. Unlike jazz, or blues or MOR music, or even country and western at that time, you couldn't be too old, for that, but not pop. And I thought, well, I'm going to invent a style for myself where I can feel comfortable about getting older. In fact, it'll almost be an advantage. Yeah. People will envy me, the fact that I'm older. It's got to be a much more confessional sort of style, not whining and moaning, it's got to be sort of soulful, but approachable, and I had all these sort of theories and I could go on about it, but
Can I actually say one thing though? Talking about is that what I always remember is whenever I used to go to No Miss Studios in the 80s, in the canteen there was a photo of you on the wall, and you're tucking in. You're wearing a very, very smart suit, and it just says "Thinking of buying the joint." And it was one of those things that whenever I saw it, it was like all is well with the world.
Oh, that's beautiful. Well, all is well with the world with you in it, Nick. It certainly is. Thank you so much. I mean, brilliant. We're so glad to have you on.
Ready.
Well, it's very sweet of you to have invited me, and I'm very flattered seeing the company I seem to be keeping with this. But thanks very much, fellas, and I hope to see you socially before too long.
Well, absolutely. That would be great.
All the best, sir.
All the best. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Well, that's it for this week's Rockonteurs, and thanks for listening, and thanks especially to Nick Lowe.
Don't forget, you can listen to previous episodes of the series and make sure you leave a nice review too. It all helps.
Yes, please.
We are back next week, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.